We'll feel in the house.
Well, it could be a first chair if you want.
Good morning.
Good morning.
My watch says 9:45, and that clock looks like it's about 9:45 too. So let's get going. Thank you for being here this morning for our time of adult education. We're going to be hearing from Conor Williams talking about his time in seminary so far, and it was fun preparing for this earlier this week to hear about all that how you're being shaped and formed, and all the life and excitement that comes with that. So thank you for being with us today, Conor. So just like before we get into some of the questions, just kind of explain kind of your in short your journey to seminary, and what seminary has looked like for you now. Are you your school is in St. Paul, but you're obviously not living in St. Paul. So how does that all work? Can I say, how's your semester going? What does that all look like?
Sure. So I'm grateful. I go to Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and there's two things that have really been very helpful to me. One is that they have online classes, and so I can discharge my responsibilities and commitments to my wife and our kids and my work, and also go to seminary at the same time. And the structure, that's one thing. The second thing is that Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota is currently offering scholarships for people who want to attend there. So I'm very grateful that I attend there and I don't have to pay for tuition. And but there's 4 terms, and each term starts with a residential session where I go up to St. Paul for a week and have intensive classes for a week, about 40 hours of lectures for a week. And that's a long week. It's also exciting to be in the class with others, and I've got folks, I'm old, I'm 60, I just turned 60, and I thought I would be very old for seminary, but there's people who are older than me, a lot of people who are younger, people from all walks of life, and I'm grateful that Lisa and I have good friends who live in Minneapolis, and I can stay with them while I attend a week class. And then when I come back and I have classes online then each week. I take 2 classes a term at the moment, and seminary is very exciting. I suppose that's how I describe it. I don't quite know what I'm doing, but we worship the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, and Abram didn't know what he was doing when he left the city of Ur. So there's a part of the journey of faith is that we don't really know what we're doing. And that's not to be an excuse for not being diligent about things, but it's in the unknowingness that the Spirit acts, I think. And so I'm very grateful for that. Does it make sense from a worldly perspective that I'm 60 and going to seminary? I don't know. It wouldn't, on the surface it wouldn't, but so much about God is below the surface. It's not on the surface, and so I'm enjoying it a lot. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Conor. And so I'm going to be asking Conor some questions and dialoguing and engaging with what you're talking about, Conor. And we'll have some time, I expect, at the end for questions. But by all means, if you want to chime in and join the conversation as it goes, don't hesitate to raise your hand, and we'll invite you in to want to make sure that we're reflecting on things that engage you and interest you. So just to start though, I'm struck, Conor, that whether you're talking about people not knowing where they're going, that's something that intrigued me about seminary too, is that people that are in seminary are works in progress, that they're figuring out where God's calling them, how God's calling them, what they want to do professionally, and also just do with their seminary training, that those two things don't always overlap. And so that's interesting to me, and ultimately, inspiring to me that how God can work through all kinds of different sorts of people and in different sorts of ways. So you said you've been really enjoying kind of what's been going on at seminary. So just what classes have you been taking, and what classes have most interested you so far?
So the first two classes I took last semester were Thinking Theologically and Confessing Publicly with Dr. Amy Marga, and that was my final paper there, which I'll be happy to tell people about later. Then the other class was Christian Public Leaders or Christian Public Leadership, and that's been a subtle transition for me. My faith is a largely, I would say, largely a private thing up to this point, and then how do I transition into proclaiming the gospel in a public way, and doing it in a way that honors God and doesn't, avoids the sin of the Pharisees, where it's all about me. And I really liked both, and that other class, Christian Public Leadership, was taught by Dr. Terry Elton and Dr. Rolf Jacobson. And there's very strong women professors who are also pastors up at Luther Seminary. I appreciate that. And both of those classes were excellent. We had a book by Eugene Peterson that we studied for Christian Public Leadership. Eugene Peterson translated the Bible into the Message, and just a wonderful, faithful man, and in some ways countercultural to the United States. And I really liked his book, Working the Angles. There were some truths that were revealed to me in that book that I just love. One is that language serves the purpose of fostering relationship. And I'm an economist by training, and my perspective was, language is a means for transmission of information, and information is a means for promoting efficiency and productivity, and that's I really appreciated Eugene Peterson's concept there. And then I've never quite known how to fit the Greek myths into the biblical narrative, because there are truths that are revealed in the Greek myths, but the gods in the Greek myths are very capricious and very variable, and I really liked a perspective that Eugene Peterson had, that the Hebrews have a prayer for every instance, and the Greeks have a story for every instance to reveal aspects of human nature. And his thinking is liberating to me. And Rolf Jacobson and Terry Elton also, there's this beautiful thing about language and words, that God spoke the universe into being, and God speaks this next moment into being. And words are sacred, and we're very careless with our words in America, and words exist for the purpose of building up the community and liberating people, but words can be used to demean and oppress people, and but words are sacred. And Ralph Jacobson had this beautiful concept that we are each born into a river of language. Long before we ever say our first word, we are immersed in this river of language from our parents, from the community that we're in, and then at some stage we say our first word. And Eugene Peterson, extends that about prayer, that all prayer from us human beings is in response to the prayer that's already been spoken by God, that God has spoken us into being, and that we should have reverence for that. And Peterson gets his goat at the community gathering, when somebody half-heartedly says to the pastor, "Oh, let's start with an opening prayer," and there's a lack of regard for that. But God has spoken all that we know and see and experience into being, and so we should be careful with our words. Amy Marga's class, there were 9 books, and I remember getting shocked when learning at the beginning on the syllabus that we were supposed to have read all the books before the class started. And I was thinking, I quite often feel like I'm in over my head, but so then we get to class, and she says, that's fine, you don't have to have read them all, but the books go from Augustine's Confessions to a book on LGBT theology, Black Power by James Cone. There's a book by Elizabeth Johnson, She Who Is, Conceiving of God as a Woman rather than a Man. There was a book on the theology of other creatures, and then Gustavo Gutierrez's The Theology of Liberation. And that was a very rich class. And the theme there is that God is in the business of liberation. God is not in the business of constraining us to fit as square pegs into a round hole. God is there to liberate us from those things that constrict life in us, I suppose. And so I really liked her class. I liked both of those classes very much. And this term I'm doing Justice and Reconciliation with Dr. Lois Malcolm, and then Theological Frameworks with Dr. Andy Root, who I know who you appreciate, and I do too. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about some high points for you in seminary, Pastor Kevin, if you'd be willing to.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll keep this fairly brief because I'm struck that as we've talked, I did the majority of my seminary education at Yale Divinity School, and then as a part of my ordination requirements, went to a Lutheran seminary and went to Luther Seminary for about a semester, a little bit more than a semester afterwards. So it's been about 10 years, a little under 10 years since I was at Luther, and I'm struck that as we talk, even like the academic calendar has changed over those 10 years. Like a lot of those names of the professors are the same, but a lot has shifted. So theological education is changing fast, at some spots more than others. And I had a little bit of a different experience in that for Yale Divinity School was, and I think really still is really a residential kind of only model. So not everybody has to live on campus, but there isn't going to be online coursework. Everybody needs to be able to get into a seat at least a couple times a week for a class. And so that was one thing that was a little bit different. Another thing that was different for me is that at Yale Divinity School, it's a mix of roughly 50-50 between people that are seeking a Master's of Divinity, which is the degree with which one is moving towards ordination or something kind of equivalent to that. And about 50% are seeking a Master's of Arts, which is more like an academic degree. So you have people in class that are seeking to, for instance, go into the academy or seeking to go into the clergy. There's a lot of other kind of in-between or somewhere else altogether. Like for instance, there was a person a grade ahead of me that was really interested in like religious journalism, and so she was able to both take journalism classes. I know her highlight of her studies was she took a class with Bob Woodward at Yale when he was there, and then so since seminary, she, after getting an MDiv, the same degree I got, she has worked for, is it the Deseret Times? Deseret News, the kind of like the LDS Associated Papers, though she is not Mormon, and she is like their nationwide religion reporter. Mm-hmm. And so you can see all sorts of funny directions, but for me it was really interesting to go to be in a setting where there were a lot of people that were going all sorts of different, with different aims and different backgrounds. It made lunchtime conversation very lively and engaging and interesting. And so seminary for me was kind of a mix of taking coursework that prepared me for being a pastor. That also, I found, at least at Yale, the best way to take classes was not even always about finding the name of the class that interested me most, and as much as finding the professors that I liked, and then just took everything that they took, or they taught. So I ended up taking a lot of coursework on like early church theology. I had a professor named Chris Bealey, who is actually in the, you're talking about shifted over 10 years. So he was a kind of a patristic theology scholar of like 4th century like theologians, especially a guy named Gregory of Nazianzus. Then from there he went and then headed the Episcopal seminary within Duke Divinity School, and he has now since returned to be a pastor of a large church in, I think, Dallas, somewhere in Texas. And so he's one of those interesting people that really straddled the academy and the clergy, which isn't always the case at a spot like Yale. And so I wanted to take everything he taught. So I can, if you're interested in like stuff that happened between like the 2nd and 8th century and like what theologians think about it, I'm happy to talk with you about Maximus the Confessor and and Irenaeus of Lyon and all that. So that was really fun, and learned a lot about how the people in the early church interpreted the Bible. And there was a sense, like you were describing with words, like a sense of play that they often use that was very novel to me. And then I also took a lot of coursework from somebody named Brett Simmons, who was kind of a theological ethicist and particularly interested in like kind of like cosmology and environmental ethics. And so that taught a lot of coursework that was like a lot around like questions of suffering. And while I'm not a environmental ethicist by training, or like with career aspirations, those questions about what do we do with God and suffering, that's kind of like seeped its way into my brain and my heart as well. And I loved being able to take coursework as well from, with all sorts of different kinds of people. That was like one thing that was really valuable to me, that I would, like why I would advocate going for an ecumenical seminary, and there's a lot of benefits also going to a denominational seminary. I can remember we would have these, like, I can't even remember what they called it, but they just bring in like guest pastors from the area or all over the place just to kind of talk about their ministry. And one they brought in was just from down the road, maybe about 45 minutes away. That was from Newtown UCC, who organized the prayer vigil after Sandy Hook. And hearing him talk about organizing that and how that emerged out of the clergy in that community being in community with one another, and just already knowing each other. I can remember him being struck by saying, organizing the vigil is the easiest thing that week, because we already knew each other. We could just text each other and say what time and we'd be there. And so for me, practicing being in class already with UCC folks, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Roman Catholics, Methodists, like that was helpful, because it's easy in a denomination like this weekend. We had a training for Lutherans all over the Milwaukee metro, but it's also good for me to practice and be familiar with the Episcopalians and the Methodists, and so I really valued that as well, and have some dear friends that are Methodists and Episcopalian now from seminary as well.
Good. So you're talking about changes, and Lois Malcolm's been a professor up at Luther Seminary. She was one of the very first women professors, and she's been there for decades, and she was talking about how originally Luther Seminary was full of pious Norwegian farmer boys who, from families that didn't have a lot of money, and they would go there to become pastors. And she said the changes she's seen have been profound. And so in Lois Malcolm's class, we were doing the first day introduction, and the person beside me introduced themselves and explained that he preferred the pronouns of they, them, not he or she. And I introduced myself, and then the person on the other side of me introduced himself. He's an older man, and he said, I don't do pronouns. And so those fractures that exist out in the world are also in the classroom, and I think that's good, because And the fellow who doesn't do pronouns is from a church that came out of the Jesus movement, which was the hippies in California in the 1960s that I'd never heard of before. And I'm thinking, well, I thought all hippies were liberals, and he's so conservative, and how does that all add up? And so it's, the world and the universe is a much bigger place than I conceived for it to be, and that's a good thing.
Thank you. So you've taken a couple classes so far. You've been surrounded by a lot of different people. Seminary there is pastoral formation and practical formation, and a lot of it too is just being in the classroom too, or being in a digital classroom and reading. You mentioned a lot of different theologians. I'm guessing many theologians are areas of study that probably some of you were like, what is that? What has been most intellectually stimulating for you so far in seminary? What are the things that you've been chewing on from your reading in your classes?
Gosh, that's a good... some theological books are very dry. There's a lot of new large words that I get a bit frustrated with. And to be honest, even some of them, I look up dictionaries and in the dictionary there isn't a definition for the word triumphalistic. But I suppose going into any new field, there's that unfamiliarity. I guess I appreciate Dr. Lois Malcolm talks about we in the Western thought suffer from Platonism, where we separate our mind from our heart, from our body, from our soul. And she brings us back to first century Judaism, where there just is our being. And that's been helpful to me. My wife is here, so I'll share something. Sometimes I will think about things, and I mean, this sounds absurd. Sometimes I'll think about things and I'll think because I've thought about it, I've done it. And I haven't. And if I have a weakness, it's being too much in my mind. And I appreciate Dr. Lois Malcolm sort of returning us to ourselves. She has us dancing and singing, and I grew up in a large family, 5 brothers and 3 sisters, and part of me as I'm up there dancing and singing, I'm thinking, oh, if my childhood brothers could see me now as they were when we were all children, I would be, I would feel very embarrassed, or I would be the butt of a lot of jokes. But the open-heartedness to that which is new, and Christ making all things new. I really like Andy Root has one phrase that he uses a lot. God brings life out of death. And wherever we experience death or closeness, God has, and another phrase that God makes a way out of when there is no way. And that's just beautiful. I'm not sure that there's just been one thing. I think what I like most about is being in class, and I like most when class is an interactive dialogue led by the professor and guided by it, but not exclusively just from their material. I think that's what I like most.
Yeah.
Just a quick question.
Yeah. Chuck, follow up.
Do you mean in class, like you're physically in St. Paul?
Yes.
As opposed to doing it on, okay.
Yeah. Online is a good substitute, but physically in class is best. Yeah.
Yeah, I can agree. You can't, argue or ask follow-up questions as easily in online. Online, you end up having people kind of share their thought, and that there isn't as much of that back and forth. So there is a gift for online. There's a convenience to it, but I like being, physically with one another. I loved your answer there, in that what is that in your seminary formation, you can't just separate how you're being intellectually shaped from how you're being shaped personally and spiritually. So I hear that, and at the same time, how is this shaping you spiritually? What is seminary doing to your faith?
So Lisa and I talk about when we were kids, sometimes you'd experience something and you knew it wasn't quite right, but you didn't have the words, the understanding to name what was wrong about it. And it's like being at seminary, there's more instances where there are things that didn't sit right with my spirit that I now am acquiring the language to be able to say why I don't think that is pleasing to God. The variety of, I've forgotten the question you're asking me.
Just how seminary is shaping your faith?
Oh yeah, I do love that idea that we form each other. As we interact with each other, we form each other. And that when sometimes we interact in each other in a way that is not God's intention, we deform each other. And when we encounter the healing of others, we reform each other. And that's to do with the shape of our personhood. And I like that there's such openness. There's a tremendous lack of one of the books I like is The Cross in Our Context by Douglas John Hall, who was a student of Paul Tillich, and I've read a little bit of Paul Tillich over the years, and Douglas John Hall talks about the theology of the cross, that there's two theologies. There's the theology of glory, which is the triumphalistic God who's coming in as the king, the sovereign king. And then there's the theology of the cross, which is that we are closest to God when we participate, when we're involved in the suffering of the world. And I really like that. And one of the things that Douglas John Hall talks about is in the Western world, the younger generation are done with triumphalistic systems that pretend to explain everything but end up oppressing some people to do so. And that his thing about postmodernism, which I've always been critical of postmodernism, we're not going to believe in anything on trust, we gotta, each person following their own path. But for the first time, that idea of the anxiety that is prevalent in our wider world, the questioning, the skepticism, that's actually can be perceived as a good thing. That people are not looking for the easy, simplistic answers that end up harming others. That people are genuinely looking for God, and that we find God in the cross. And it reminds me of Pastor Gary. Years ago, he gave a sermon about going to a funeral, and there was a family member at that funeral that in the past had been quite antagonistic whenever Gary would meet him, about, oh, you can't believe that stuff. And Gary explained in the sermon, the one inevitability is that we will all suffer and that we will all die. And Gary said, if we don't go to the foot of the cross, where do we go? And all those other things turn to ash ultimately. Our 401ks won't save us, our big homes, our guns, our degrees. And so there's something beautiful in that I really appreciate. So.
Yeah, and I might add that if you're going to seminary, there's a good chance you'd come out the other end with a 403B, not a 401K. There is a little bit of training about kind of church management. I took a course on church management, and that was helpful. But ultimately, I find that there's a lot of really good tools that seminary gives, like tools to engage with like questions of suffering, but there's a lot of things at least in pastoral preparation, that's that you just kind of have to practice and do. Like, we were talking about like a preaching class, and I don't know, I didn't love my preaching class. Maybe if somebody had a preaching professor that they were like blown away by, they might have had a different experience, but I've just found the best way to prepare for preaching or getting improved is just to listen to people that we think are good preachers, and which is a lot easier with the internet. Thank you, internet. And then just to practice. And like same thing with like church management. Like there's no, like learning all those financial nuts and bolts just takes just asking a lot of questions, but having a kind of a question about how does this fit into advancing what God is up to in the world. Those kind of big questions are the things that seminary at its best is inviting us to give us that kind of, be able to bring that to bear to talking about matters of governance and dollars and cents and 401ks and 403bs and all of that. Thank you, Conor. I have some more questions for you, but I'm curious if we have any questions. I'll start over here, then head this way. Yes?
Well, Conor, I know you from St. Matthew's, but I also know you more recently in your work. I don't know if you'd call it prison ministry or social justice ministry. And I'm sort of struck by your talking about, the river that we're born into, whether it's words or faith or prayer. And I think about, I'm an older student. I'll be defending my dissertation in May, but I'm thinking about how, as an older student, as someone with a lot of lived experience and a lot of work in this, in the kind of ministry that you've been doing, I'm wondering about the moments when you're recognizing things that you've been doing, or recognizing theologies or approaches to faith and the work that you do that relates to what you have been doing.
So the question, there was a lot. I'm going to try and concisely summarize it.
Sorry.
So Conor, that you are someone that, at least maybe compared to what the conception of what a seminarian is, has some life experience and isn't just like, fresh out of undergrad. How does that life experience that you have, with economics and with prison ministry and in various other aspects of your life, how is that affecting your studies, and what is it like to come with all of that experience and perspective and bringing that to a classroom?
Mm-hmm. Did that summarize it okay?
And how does the classroom help
Yeah.
you sort of reimagine or understand better what you're doing? What
Yeah.
you're doing?
I'd say I'm grateful. I'm grateful that on Friday mornings, Chuck and Don Schaefer and Carl Lund and I and Craig Seeley head down to Community Warehouse Partners in Hope, and we have Bible studies with them. Hello. We have Bible studies with guys who've spent decades in prison. Most of whom are African American, and that's something that led me to seminary, because Phil Harvey, who is a good friend of ours, Phil is truly a new man in Christ. He was in prison for over 30 years, and you couldn't meet a gentler, kinder, more compassionate, more loving person. And part of me in my work, I have a calling for justice, and but part of me wants to be more involved with that which has transformed Phil into a new man, and Bible study is one of those things. And I believe exposure to the living Word of God is just transformative, whether we are intentional about that or not. And I think that's a great gift that Lutherans bring to the church, to the world. I've got Catholic friends who say they really miss that in the tradition they grew up in, there wasn't the sitting down in the democratic, egalitarian way of reading Scripture together and sharing what we think it means. And when we do that in community, God shows up. And And the results are lives transformed, like Phil Harvey's, who now is transforming other people's lives. And I'm 60, so God willing, I'll have a number of decades ahead of me. I just want to spend those decades involved in that work, because it's truly, as Andy Wood says, it's bringing life out of death. And so that's what, that's my answer.
Something in his mouth.
Just a quick follow-up.
Sure.
As part of my work, I've been interviewing folks who are working with reentry organizations, clients or participants in reentry organizations. And I do remember one man telling me that people at the organization spoke life into him, spoke into his new self into him. And I think that sense of community is really important. So, anyways, I appreciate what you
Thank you. So I see your hand. I'll get to it in a second. I just wanted to engage real quick with what you were saying, that I wasn't straight out of undergrad when I went to seminary, but I was on the younger end, and I can say that I could tell a difference between people that went straight. There was nobody that went to seminary this fresh, but you can tell the difference between somebody that goes straight from undergrad into seminary and those that have had some experience in the world. It makes a difference in that it's an intellectual exercise being in seminary, but it's more than that. And there's a 20th century French social theorist who I really appreciate named Michel Desserteau. He was also a Catholic priest, and I believe he was a Jesuit priest, and a kind of a contemporary, like I guess you could say, continental philosopher and social theorist. And he talks about how really most people are just trying to make do. Mm-hmm. And the image he uses is he's reflecting on New York City, and this is written before September 11th. So he talks about there's like the city planner kind of sits atop the World Trade Center and can look down and see the city. And then there's also people that just walk the streets and kind of create their own routes through the city and are just trying to survive and don't even have maybe a less ordered vision of what life looks like as a city. They're just trying to get from point A to point B. And having some time before seminary, just really trying to get from point A to point B with my job and just get through each day, I felt like was a helpful orientation point for me in seminary too. So that perspective and that orientation, that groundedness is really important. So yes, 3 cheers to people that have that aren't a pipeline from undergrad into seminary. As Don.
Well, Conor, you always say, "Oh, I'm 60 and this and that and the other thing." Take it from a guy that was 21 when you were born. How old were Sarah and Abraham when they prayed to God for a child? Mm-hmm. So I noticed Lisa's here, so when Conor's 90 and you hear him praying, listen real closely to what he's praying for.
I got a good story about that, Pastor. So there's an older woman who's part of my class called Jo Ellen that I really like, and she grew up in one of the conservative Lutheran synods, and she was quite harmed in her conception of God by the community of faith that she grew up in. And she's now going to seminary to become a pastor, and she's older than me, and she has a spiritual director. And she was saying, I don't know if I should go to seminary. She said, I'm going to be 65 before I become a pastor. And the spiritual director said to her, you're going to be 65 anyway, so I'm not just a pastor. So I really like Jo Ellen. She's a breath of fresh air to me.
That's funny. I saw a couple other hands over here. Yes, Dave?
I'm wondering about the differing acceptances of the role of deacon within the ELCA. In my own background in the LCMS, there was an attempt to envision different kinds of roles because there were so many vacant churches in rural areas or whatever, and so they experimented with deacon for a while. I don't know that went very far. they experimented with lay minister for a good many years and still do, although that appears to be controversial because many a conservative pastor will say, you know, they're not ordained and they can't celebrate the Eucharist, and therefore we should abolish the entire lay ministry program or whatever. I'm just wondering how the acceptance has been as the role of deacon and an ordained deacon evolves.
So thank you, Dave. So as some background, even to Dave's question about Conor, you kind of working towards being a deacon. You are in seminary in a program to become a deacon, which officially is called a minister of word. So hey, and remember that word thing again, and service. Whereas I am a minister of word and sacrament. So yeah, you need to go to seminary before you can take this microphone. I'll only say that to you. No one else is going to get told that. Yeah, so tell us a little bit more about your journey to being a deacon. What is that? What do you understand that to mean, and what have you observed about that acceptance in seminary thus far?
So it seems like the ELCA's had some complicated relationship with the idea of deacons. In me reading a little bit of the history, and one of the additional reasons why I'm in seminary is because as an economist, I'm a social scientist, and there's the demographic realities that many more pastors and leaders of the church are retiring than are coming out of seminary. And that's, I think many of our challenges as a community are because we've neglected to nurture our faith, our communal faith. And so that's one of the reasons I'm at seminary. I do see the work that I do in the secular world as a form of ministry. And so as a deacon, what role will I play in the body of the church? I actually don't know, Dave. I do have an idea that I'd like to preach, and I also like Andy Root's perspective that pastors are shepherds. We shepherd each other. That God is a shepherd. There's another thing that Ralph Jacobson told us. In the New Testament, there are 92 different ideas shared about who God is, from Jesus saying, I was a hen wanting to care for the chicks, to the Lamb of God, to the shepherd. And so where, I guess part of my thinking, Dave, is that me in community with the church will determine best, and the community of faith, where should I use my gifts in the great order of things. And I'm not sure where that is. I might go on to become a pastor. I'm not sure. And you think at 60 I'd know more, but it's just where it is.
Yeah, I'll get to that in just 1 second. But I think it's interesting. The ELCA is still figuring out what is a deacon. It's even confusing that sometimes the assisting minister in church in certain congregations will call that a deacon. Or if you were an Episcopalian, you get ordained into the diaconate and then ordained as a priest. So the term deacon can mean different things, and in practice, what that often looks like is, a deacon is a 2-year degree program often. Being a pastor is a 3-year degree program often. And if one wants to go into pastoral ministry but has kind of a niche of things that they're interested in, I'm going to give some examples. I really want to do campus ministry, or I really want to do camping ministry, like work at like a Lutherdale, or I really want to be a hospital chaplain, for instance, or I really want to go into the academy, get a doctoral degree, and teach kind of the standard position historically of the ELCA. I don't know how much it's changed even since I started to be like, great, I'm glad you feel called to that, but if you feel called to be a pastor, you're going to spend 3 years in a congregation first. And there is looseness in being a deacon, and that you can say, I feel called to be a deacon, and I feel called to be a chaplain. great, you can go straight from seminary into being a chaplain. So there's a gift to that. Whereas the ELCA's imagination of what it means to be a pastor is, still that is an ongoing thing that the ELC is having to figure out, and I think improving it. One challenge is that with being a pastor, you're going to go where the church has sent you at first, which is great when there was a day where there was the pastor and his wife, and his wife supported him in his ministry, and so they could just go to Western North Dakota for 3 years and then move somewhere else because she was just going to be a homemaker. That's not the reality anymore. And if our theology says that God called people into all sorts of careers and not just being pastors, well, the ELC is having to reckon with what do we do with that. And so there's some shifting that's happening, and there is some, and the flexibility that comes with being a deacon is exciting, but it's also, you often have to kind of chart your own path. Yesterday at the all-day Synod training event here, we had a representative from Global Refuge, formerly Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, and the person that came was actually in seminary with me, or a couple years behind me in seminary, and she's ordained as a deacon, and her diaconal ministry is kind of being a liaison between Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, Global Refuge, and congregations. Julie, so you had a hand up.
When you were talking about shepherding my late husband was clergy, okay, and his definition of clergy was Jesus is the good shepherd, and the job of the clergy are to be the sheepdog and move the people closer to God.
Yeah, so Jesus is the good shepherd and the clergy are the sheepdog. I kind of like that.
He actually, one of his congregations actually gave him a sheepdog.
Nice. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, Dave.
A quick follow-up on what you were saying. So some years ago, I went to a seminary of the Church of the Brethren. It was in Oak Brook, Illinois, and I did a DMin there. And I was fascinated by their teaching. They had a doctrine which was called calling out gifts. Mm-hmm. And so if someone in the congregation struck you, a young man, for example, that he was a good person in this or that, then you might say as a layperson to them, I think God is calling you to this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that they would take that then seriously and try to have the whole congregation get behind that. So if the whole congregation said, yes, indeed, we too think you're being called to this, they would enforce it. So that struck me, and when I was a Lutheran pastor in Itasca, Illinois, we needed an evangelist and we needed a youth director, and we needed a deacon. And so we just called out gifts and we ordained them in our own way. And people would say, what, you ordained them a deacon? I said, why not? we're a congregation, we can do that. And so we just did it.
Yeah, I love that. And I think one thing that the ordination process, regardless of kind of how it's expressed, it's never just something between like me and God. There's also always a community of people that says, I see this in you and I want to support you in that. And like you were talking about how faith is for you, Conor, has historically been a private thing. There's always some sort of public and social dimension to it. Starting in baptism, there's a reason we do baptisms in public, so that there's a whole body of people that have our backs. And with that, that's a great transition that when we were talking earlier this week, you were talking, Conor, about how you feel like as you've been in seminary, you feel like you really brought St. Matthew's with you, and you feel like you've been supported by St. Matthew's along the way. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah, so earlier I was talking about how we form each other by being in relationship with each other. And so me going to seminary is partly a result of being formed by this community. And I was thinking of two instances about that. But through Stephen Ministry, knowing Dee Burchell, and Dee at one stage in the continuing education at Stephen Ministry recommended a book called Jesus Calling. And so I got that book and I started reading it, and it's a daily devotion, 365 days a year. It has a short reflection and then some scripture. And one of those days I'm reading it, and it says, it's spoken in the first person of Jesus, says, you know, it says, I'm with you and I'm for you. And I never encountered Jesus in that way before. I always knew that God was with me, but that God is for me. And there was parts of that I got, but just reading that in that daily devotion at that time, that God is for us. He doesn't seek to oppress us or constrain us. He's for us. He wills the good for us. And that was just really a gift that came to me through UD. And then Jeff Bodwin came to the men's retreat, and he was saying that he enjoyed listening to John Orthberg. It's 10 minutes a day, and it's a reflection. And I was sharing it with my wife as we took a trip to Cincinnati this past weekend for a funeral. And John Orthberg, there's parts of him that I like, but there's he's a little bit, there's parts of him that Lisa doesn't like. He's a bit too much a white man's Christianity with the flavor or dimension of mega church about him. And I appreciate that, but there's things that I get from John Orthberg, and one of them is, and Jeff Bowden suggested that to me, one is that when you love people, you will the good for them. And I grew up, there was 11 years between us, 9 kids, and part of my growing up was an effort to differentiate myself into my own personhood. And with being so close to my brothers and sisters, I didn't always will the good for them. I wanted to, if they did well at something, sometimes that would elicit what I now recognize as jealousy in me. And that I was somehow lesser because they were greater. And that's just not, that's not loving. And so the starting of Stephen ministry, I remember having trepidation about being a Stephen minister. I know nothing about, I've not had cancer, I haven't lost my spouse, I haven't been divorced. How can I be of any help to people who go through such things? And the truth is, the gift of presence in the presence of God is healing. And even when I don't have words, and that's just a beautiful revelation that would not have come to me but for Stephen Ministry. So I'm grateful for this community of faith nurturing the spirit, and because it's nurtured my spirit, and the world desperately needs the Spirit of God. Desperately. There's so many of our challenges have at their root idolatry and false constructs of God or godlessness. The world desperately needs the love of Christ, so it does.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I appreciate you sharing the gift of just of sharing resources, whether it's a daily 10-minute podcast or a book, devotional book like Jesus Calling. So you said that I was reminded of, I didn't take this class in seminary, but my friends took a course on Jürgen Moltmann, who is considered, he passed away a year ago. At the time, was probably like the top living theologian. Very significant late 20th century German theologian who's made a huge, when you're talking about a lot of those people you rattled off, there is no Gustavo Gutierrez or Elizabeth Johnson or James Cone as we know it without Jürgen Moltmann. And then before him, probably the greatest living theologian is a guy named Karl Barth, who wrote a huge volume of works called the Church Dogmatics. Barth wrote a lot. He once quipped, I don't think I've even read everything I've written. Wrote a lot. Barth's Church Dogmatics are probably in theological, academic circles, probably the most consequential work probably since the Reformation. And so my friends that were in this reading course on one of the greats of recent theology of Jürgen Moltmann. Actually got to have a Zoom call with Jürgen Moltmann, who, when he was over in Germany. And somehow Bart came up in the conversation. My friends relayed to me that Jürgen Moltmann said about Karl Barth, anything that took that many words to say couldn't possibly be true. And so you don't have to always have the longest or most letters or claim behind one's name. There can be a lot of wisdom in in those works that we share with one another that we can read before, during, or after seminary. And one more with that, with you talking about willing to love. You talked earlier about Augustine's Confessions. Before seminary, I read Augustine's Confessions, but in seminary I was able to read more of his theological works, and I found him a really profound thinker. He wrote a book that's titled something like, there's not really a good English translation. Sometimes it's called like On Christian Teaching, often in English. It's often known by its Latin name, De Doctrina Christiana, which you could also translate like On Christian Doctrine. It's kind of this little handbook for pastors that couldn't make it to seminary, and incredibly consequential work that he's talking about how to read the Bible for these people. And he kind of summarizes it at the end by going through this whole long, like pretty philosophically sophisticated way of engaging the Bible that still holds up pretty well. And he says, just to summarize it, if you read the Bible and it doesn't build up love of God or love of neighbor, which again, Jesus says are the greatest commandments, because you haven't quite figured it out yet. Go read it a little bit more. And I was like, wow, that was 1,500 years ago. That holds up pretty well and is a pretty profound statement. And so talking about that willing of, that love, willing care for one another, don't need to go to seminary for that. But there's you can get an intellectual framework to think through that for sure. I see we got about 4 minutes to go, so I have some more questions for you, but I also don't want to make sure anybody is missing a chance to ask questions. Does anybody else have any things they would like to ask? Cool, I'm going to go back to my sheet. So Conor, you have some quotes you wanted to share. You also have that poster you'd like to share.
Sure.
Are any of those things you want to lift up in those final few minutes? I want to make sure you get a chance to share.
Sure.
Some of that stuff you're bringing from Luther back to here in Tosa.
Sure.
I got a couple of quotes I'd like to share. Gustavo Gutierrez wrote The Theology of Liberation 50 years ago. And liberation theology played out a lot when I was starting to become aware of the wider world in South and Central America. And Pope Francis is a big fan of the liberation theology of liberation. But he just recently died, Gustavo Gutierrez. But there's a quote from his book that I really like, and I'll read it to you. Human existence in the last instance is nothing but a yes or a no to the Lord. Persons already partly accept communion with God, although they do not explicitly confess Christ as their Lord, insofar as they are moved by grace, sometimes secretly, renounce their selfishness, and seek to create an authentic fellowship among human beings. They reject union with God insofar as they turn away from the building up of this world, do not open themselves to others, and culpably withdraw into themselves. And then he references Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. But any act of love has its origin in God and is pleasing to God. Whether the person performing that act of love is a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or Buddhist or an atheist, all acts of love have their origins in God. And that was helpful to me. And then there are people who claim to be Christians who are not loving, and that is that is not pleasing to God. And then Douglas John Hall, and I referenced this a little earlier, The Cross in Our Context, published in 2003. The only antidote to religious triumphalism is the readiness of communities of faith to permit doubt and self-criticism to play a vital role in the life of faith. Unfortunately, it is unusual when a religious faith leaves room for profound questioning of itself on the part of its adherents. Even more rarely does religion actually invite and encourage such questioning. And if we want to understand why historic religions everywhere have been under duress throughout this modern period, it is surely in large measure because so many human beings refuse almost intuitively to give a priori assent to any explanation of existence that asks for it on the basis of authority alone, on the basis, for instance, of long establishment. Triumphalism, both political and religious, has been dealt a severe blow throughout the period, and especially in the previous 20th century. Could one perhaps say that what we call postmodernity is precisely the flowering of human skepticism concerning all triumphalistic systems, above all modernity itself, a skepticism that was brewing throughout the modern period and was conspicuously vindicated by the failure of so many of those systems in the latter part of the previous century. When Pastor Margaret first came here, she explained in having a late calling to ministry in life, she struggled with that. And the more she struggled with it, she got depressed. And she struggled with her depression. She'd been raised by parents who had survived the Second World War in Denmark and who were fearful of the world and wanted Margaret to follow a very straight path so as to not invite difficulties on herself. And Margaret struggled with honoring her parents, which is the fourth commandment, and honoring God, which is the first commandment. And in her struggle, she was somewhat paralyzed. And the more she was paralyzed, the more depressed she became. And then she honored that calling of God, but she wasn't, as with Abraham, we're not sure of it. And as she did, she started to flower as a human being and got better. And why do I bring that up?
Triumphalism was where you started.
Yeah, but there was, that was the first time I'd ever encountered somebody talk about depression as a spiritual matter. And that in some ways, the depression was an invitation from God for Margaret to be reborn into the full person that she was created to be. And with Douglas John Hall, our oldest daughter Maeve now is 25, and her generation and our younger daughters, there's an awful lot of anxiety among young people. This idea that anxiety is an invitation from God to us as a community to be more faithful is the beauty of the suffering of birth. It's not the end suffering of death. And so this idea is that the mental health challenges that we have as a community has this spiritual dimension to it, and that it's God calling us to come back into community, into right community with Him and with each other, I find life-giving and beautiful. So
When I hear that quote about religious triumphalism, I heard that telling my kid because I said so. So wearing my dad hat isn't the right answer, and also wearing my pastor hat because I said so isn't the right answer. But is that a fair assessment, you say?
Yeah.
Well, I'm inclined to agree with that too.
But it's okay to remind your kid that thou shalt honor thy mother and father.
Go read the fourth commandment, kid. Or someday he'll be able to figure that out. And with that, I'm struck too that when I heard you talking, so one of my theology professors is a guy named Miroslav Volf, and he says that the big question of theology today is what makes life worth living. And it's funny that the first day of systematic theology talked about that, and Alyssa, my wife, was like, yes, this is what I want to talk about. And then we read a bunch of sorry, Irina, old German guys like the Friedrich Schleiermacher and stuff like that. And then Alyssa was like, where did all that go? And then at the end of the class, he wrapped it up again with, it's all about what makes life worth living. And so you those are the good questions for us to be asking, and seeing this kind of formation and these conversations we have are an account of what makes a good life as well. And theology in seminary is one way to engage that, for sure. And I'm happy to keep this conversation going. I'm sure you are. I know if this piqued any interest, let's keep on chatting. Or if you think somebody that might like going to seminary, there's a lot of seminary visit weekends coming up this spring. I know Conor can tell you a little bit more about the path to Luther as well. Be happy to keep that conversation going.
You want to close us in a word of prayer, Pastor?
But yeah, let's close us in a word of prayer. And then for those of us that are going to worship at 11, we can head that way. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. God, you call people of all kind of stripes and backgrounds, people in your early ministry, it was fishermen and tax collectors, and you still call economists and math majors and all kinds of people. As you call people, there are moments of joy, and there are also moments of bringing life from death. Continue to shape us, those that feel called to seminary and those that feel called to other things, that we may continue to live in your ways of hope, of love, of peace, of joy. We pray all this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you all for being here and for your good questions. And thank you, Conor, for sharing today.
Thanks, Pastor John.